In this video I'm going to show you how I made this movable drill bit storage for underneath my drill press so it's out of the way, but it's on wheels so I can move it around in my small shop if need be. It also holds all of the bits that I used to have scattered around my shop. So I pulled pretty much the bulk of the bits and drilling accessories I want to put in that cabinet. And the nice thing is I think I should be able to fit all this stuff in there with no problem and have room for new things, which honestly I think is one of the most important things when making jigs and storage. There's so many times I've built storage for a specific purpose and wish I would have expanded it a little bit in order to add stuff later on as my supplies grew. I have 2 drill indexes. This one's pretty complete. This one, I think most of those are actually in here, so I'll put that back together and I'll store these complete as well. And a lot of this is just miscellaneous bits. These sets of bits just came from my yard sale for a couple cups of bits, and then I have to sort through this. This is a system I adopted when way back in the beginning when I first started working to pick up some extra cash. I did some work for a local contractor, and this is how he would bring his bits to a work site. It actually works fabulously if you're a contractor because you can bring everything, so you kind of can store everything the way you want. But it's not great for a woodworker. I'm constantly searching through this. It's actually a terrible system for my shop. So it'd be nice to get all this stuff out of here and more versatile and easier to see. But I'm probably going to keep this container for when I do go to customers' homes for install. It just is a really nice way to store stuff to transport. So for the storage cabinet, I wanted to use scrap around my shop. I think the only thing I ended up buying for this was the hinges at the end of the day. So I started with some 3/4 inch walnut plywood that I ripped down into the pieces that were going to be for the final cabinet, and that the 2 wings on the side I made as one box, and then I was going to rip them down at the end. So the rough dimensions for that box are 22.5 inches tall by 8 inches wide by 12.5 inches long. And I'm going to be joining all these pieces. My 2 sides on the top and bottom are going to have rabbets, so I put my sacrificial fence and my table saw with my dado stack in there, and I cut 2 rabbets on the top side and the bottom side of my two ends. And then once I had those together, I can measure what that inner piece is going to be, because you're going to have to account for the fact that you cut a rabbet there. So that didn't end up being 12.5. It was a little bit less than that. So a lot of times for my cabinets, I just cut a rabbet on the back side of the cabinet to attach the backer, but that doesn't really look super nice. But most of the times when I'm making cabinets, you don't see the back side. So for this, since you were going to be seeing the back, I decided to cut a groove that was about 1/2 inch from the back so that the entire panel would float in that groove, and then I could veneer the back side and it would just be a cleaner look. So after I cut that groove on the front side and the back side of all of my panels, because this is going to be cut in half, I cut my back panel using the measurements, accounting for the depth of that groove. So what I'm using for this is regular grade plywood. I would have preferred cabinet grade plywood, but I didn't have enough scrap for it, so I just went with the regular grade ply. And then I could dry fit everything together, make sure that groove was cut properly, and all my pieces would go together and it would stay square. So I knew I was going to be clear coating this. That's kind of my preferred finish, but I don't really love the look of cheaper grade plywood. So in order to make it match the walnut a little bit better, I just went through and burned all the grain of that wood until it was almost completely black. Once it's finished, it's still going to look like cheaper grade plywood, but it kind of takes off that yellow look you would get with putting an oil-based finish on the pine. So then I glue this all together, and I only put glue on those rabbets because I want those panels to be able to float a little bit. I made those grooves a little bit bigger in order for those panels to float. And then I just use some band clamps. These band clamps are great, especially on smaller rectangles. They hold everything together, they pull all your corners together, and they keep everything pretty square. So before I was finished, I checked my diagonals, and then I let this set up overnight. Once the measurements on those diagonals is exact, you know that the box is square. So then the next day I came in, I took those clamps off, and I removed a lot of the glue the night before as it was drying, because on this veneered ply, the plies are really thin, so if you go to sand off a lot of that glue, sometimes you glue through the veneer. And then I just cut my box in half. This was pretty simple. It was an 8-inch box, so I just set my fence at 4 inches and cut it completely in half. So now I have my 2 wings. For the center portion of this cabinet, which is what everything is going to attach to, I have a nicer grade 4x6 that's Douglas fir. This isn't your regular get it from Lowe's 4x6. Someone gave this to me before the holidays. This is the last one I have, and I thought I would use it in something that I would have for hopefully a long time. So I just squared off the edges, because a lot of times these pieces have rounded corners and I wanted square edges. So I got it down to about 4 inches wide. I wanted the center portion to be a little bit bigger than my sides, so those are the measurements I went with, just to make it a little bit taller than the sides. So I was using scrap pieces in order to get those measurements. I wanted the 2 wings to sit at the inside edge of my center frame. So that is the measurements I'm coming from. So when you look, if you open up my cabinet, the inside frame of my 2 wings lines up with the inside frame of my cabinets and of that center portion, and that works just because the center portion is thicker. It's an 1.5 inches. So then I just went through and cut those pieces down to size once I had those measurements, and that middle portion ended up being about 23.25 inches by 4 inches by 13.5. So I was going to cut and glue these together the same way I did the cabinet, by putting rabbets on the end, but since this is thicker lumber, I decided to just gauge that thickness, which was about 1.5 inches, using the lumber, and then set up my radial arm saw to cut off the excess there instead of using my table saw. And then same process, once I had those 2 portions, could line them up where I wanted them to align with the walnut cabinet, and then cut those 2 top parts as well. Unlike the 2 walnut wings, this center cabinet, I know where I want my shelf to go, so I'm going to add the shelf before glue up, and that's simply a matter of cutting out, leaving the dado stack where I left it, leaving the radial arm saw blade where I left it, and then just cutting curves to make a recess. And the shelf is going to be 3/4 inch plywood halfway down, so it was just a 3/4 inch dado. And then this is the exact same process as the walnut cabinet. By gluing it together, it's just you're also going to be gluing that middle shelf, and then I use those strapped band clamps to get everything secured and square. For the base for my drill bit cabinet, and it's 19 by 14, so I cut 2 at 19 and 3 at 14. Now you could screw it together like this if you want, but I'm going to put laps on all of these pieces, so I half lap this whole thing together. It'll be sturdier, and I also think that my cabinet will span the gap, so it will look like one solid piece once it's on there. So I already have my radial arm saw set up to cut halfway through these pieces and a stop, so I could go through and put laps on all these corners, and then I'll have to do laps in the middle of this one. These are the wheels I have. I had these on hand. I actually have a bunch of casters. These are 3-inch. I only had swivels. I know you're supposed to use straight and swivel, but I'm probably not going to move this a ton, but it will be convenient to be able to move it. And the width of that base is basically based off of the opening I have to go over the base of my drill press, that little pedestal that's there. And I gave myself about 1 inch wiggle room so it could slide in there. I also wanted it to span out a little bit further, because most of the weight is going to be concentrated in the center of this cabinet. You want some weight on the sides so it's not top heavy, especially when you start opening the doors. So I didn't show cutting those 2x4s, but it was basically just 2 pieces that were 19 inches and 3 pieces that were 13.25 inches. And I'm going to be attaching these with laps, so I put a stop on my radial arm saw, and I gauged down halfway through that 2x4, which is going to be about 3/4 of an inch, because they're 1.5 inches thick. So I raised the blade of my radial arm saw to that, then cut a bunch of curves. Since this is all pine, it's really easy to then knock off that excess and just use a rasp to get everything nice and smooth. And then once I had that outer frame, I was able to lay everything out and then assemble it and then assemble it so that I could take measurements for that middle section. And I'm going to have the middle portion of my cabinet sitting on top of the middle portion of this platform so that I can attach the cabinet to it and make it super secure, so that middle portion I put exactly in the center. So then same process, once I had those measurements, I went and cut those curves again and then removed the excess, and then I was able to attach the whole thing. And one of the reasons that I decided to do it this way is as I've made a lot of bases with casters, and when you have them on their flat faces, it's easier to align the casters. When you are doing it with 2x4s on edge, you're usually left with 1 or 2 holes of the caster that don't meet lumber, so it doesn't make it as strong. So gluing this together was pretty easy because those laps really keep everything square, and I just put 2 screws in each corner, kind of acting as clamps for this, and I cheated them to the center so that I didn't have to worry about them getting in the way when I came time to attach the casters. The next day I went through and I removed about a 1/16 of an inch on either side with my table saw, just so it's nice and square, so those walnut wings will meet the flat faces of that center portion. And then I did the exact same thing to the base with the glue squeeze out. It just was easier to trim these to get rid of that glue instead of sanding it for about 20 minutes. So then with these pieces made, I kind of dry fit this in place just so I could see what I was working with design wise and space wise, and everything seemed to line up pretty nicely. So I was originally not super worried about those holes, but I know over time dust would just get in them. So I had some thin, already pre-finished cherry plywood, just a small scrap of it someone had given me that I probably won't use for anything else. So I just cut that to size, put some brads in it on top of that piece. It's already pre-finished, which is nice. I don't have to worry about finishing it. And now I don't have to worry about dust getting underneath this case when it's underneath the drill press. So then it came time to attach the casters. I'll probably end up swapping out some of those swivel casters if this doesn't roll smoothly. But those two in the front are locking casters, which will be nice for this. So I just pre-drilled some holes so I didn't have to worry about busting through the ends because I'm pretty close to the end grain of that lumber. And then I just put 2 screws in each for the time being because I'm probably going to have to remove these as I build them. The holes on the casters are a little big, so I just put washers over my drywall screws so that everything fit. And then it came time to edge band that walnut cabinet, and I had a bunch of walnut edge banding left over from another project. Edge banding is not one of my most favorite things to do, but it really made the cabinet look like a much more finished piece of furniture than just a plywood box. So I just work my way around the edges with this as I go. Edge banding is pretty self-explanatory. So the inner portion of this cabinet, I want to have these 2x4 wings that fan out so that when I'm standing above using the drill press, I could fan out these wings and see all the bits I have. So to start, I marked center and cut a 45 off of all the edges of my 2x4s. And this ended up being too severe of an angle, but you'll see how I fix it later on. A series of holes in these 4 blocks, and they should really hold pretty much the bulk of the drill bits I want to put in this cabinet. So what I did from drill sizes 0 to a 1/2 inch, because those are pretty much the drill bit sizes I have before you start getting into spade bits. I picked the 4 most common sizes that I use. So I have a 1/4, 5/16, 3/8, and a 1/2. And I just split up the top of my piece into tick marks so that you could drill a hole on center and still have enough room on either side for any drill bits that are a 1/4 inch down to 0. So you can see I'm going to get, this middle line doesn't count, but I'm going to get quite a few holes for this. So the spacing between these are 3/8 of an inch all the way through, and then I'm going to drill down about 1.25 inches. So the depth will change on all of these because the drill bits get longer. On the 5/16, my spacing was a 1/2 inch. So I came in a little bit off the edge so that I don't tear out the edge, and then it was a 1/2 inch spacing. I'm going to do 2 rows on each one since these 2x4s are so wide. So I'll have plenty of space to fit new bits as I get them. On the 3/8 inch, the spacing was 3/4, and then on the 1/2 inch, the spacing was 1 inch. already have my depth stop set, but like I said, I'll change it probably at the 30-inch bit. And then with my new drill press table, I already have my fence set so that this drill is centered over this far line is the one I'm drilling. And then the nice thing about this fence is when I flip it, it's going to center across this fence. So I really shouldn't have to move the fence for any of these, because these two edge marks are the same on all of my pieces. They're a 1/2 inch in from the edge, which split this into thirds, which means the circle will not, even on the 1/2 inch ones, will not go past center, which is this line. Now, this would have been easier to do before I cut my 45s, but it is what it is. So I'm just going to go through and drill all these holes. So as an addendum to this, and I ended up re-drilling this smaller one anyway, so it worked out for me, is if you want a specific one to hold a specific size shank, you actually want to drill it at a size up from that shank. The shank will still fit, a 1/4 inch drill bit shank will still fit in a 1/4 inch hole, but it's kind of a tight squeeze. So if you bump it up to the next drill bit, they'll fit in there nice. Done making all these holes, and these 3 turned out great. You could see for the 1/2 inch one, I think both of them would have fit, but it would have been really close. So on the second pass, I just eyed it in between the original and kind of made these off-center holes. The first one turned out usable, but they're just way too close together. So I think I'm actually going to remake this one, and instead of doing 1/4 inch, do a little bit thicker than a 1/4 inch. The drill bit size or so up from that, because I don't have a ton of small drill bits, and I think I'll have that one double as storage for all of my spade bits, because I do have a bunch of those, and in order to get those to fit, these shanks are a little bit thicker than a 1/4. So in order to drill the holes into either side of those 2x4s to mount them into that center cabinet, I used the end boring jig on my drill press table, and this was my first time using it for an extended task, not just filming drilling for a video or whatnot, and it worked pretty nicely once you had everything clamped in place. And if you watch my last video, it's nice because everything kind of moves somewhat easily, and you could get it back into place after using the end boring jig. So then I had holes to drill into that center cabinet, and I ended up using a doweling jig. I came in 3/4 of an inch from the end and up a little bit from the bottom, so the bottom pieces of those 2x4s float. And you'll see later in the video I end up re-drilling these holes, but these holes I made a 1/4 inch, and the holes in the actual 2x4s I made a little bit bigger so that there's a little bit of room for play, and I ended up using dowels to attach these, so if the dowels swell a little bit, you'll still be able to move those fins. The good news is this is going to work. The bad news is I completely misjudged the degree of the angle. If you open just one of these, they're going to completely open. If you open both of them, they catch on each other, and that's pretty much what I was going for. But the problem with that is you have to open them perfectly simultaneously in order to do that. So on the top bit here, I thought maybe if I flipped them they would open, and they only open a little bit. So I think what I'm going to do is mount them with the flat side facing out. I'm going to take all these off and use with my hand plane, put a slight chamfer on here until it gets to the angle I want, which isn't going to be much, and then I'll reassemble it. So the other good news is this was a very easy fix. I ended up only having to put a very small chamfer on the bottom of these 2x4s in order for everything to move. So you could see the chamfer I added on there was very slight. I took maybe 20 small passes with my hand plane to get it, and then you could see now with it back in place, it opens perfectly and stops. Even with tugging on it, it can't open anymore. Got all these opening and closing the way I would like. They all move pretty smoothly. So I have these picture buttons that usually go on the back of picture frames. Really simple. It's one screw, and then they could slide down so these can't flop out this way. I just put one on each side. They'll keep these from being able to move. And then I just have a scrap piece of 3/4 inch, I believe this is pine, so that it will fit in between these two. And then you see these won't be able to move at all. But if you open this, they'll still be able to slide out. So I used a 4-foot section of piano hinge to attach all these pieces together. I could easily cut it with an angle grinder and then clean up the edges and have 2 pieces. Now, in order to use the piano hinge, I had to mortise both portions of my cabinets, the wings and the center. So in order for the wings to open, you'll see I just cut a 45 off of that center piece so that the wings will be able to open. If you didn't do that, they would hit that back side and not be able to open. So I have a sacrificial fence in there, and the mortise you're cutting off of here, which is actually more like a dado on these pieces because it goes all the way, is very minimal. It's only about a 1/16 of an inch. It's just the thickness of that hinge. So then when I came time to cut the center one, I had to move my fence a little bit because that the lumber on this is thicker. It's not 3/4 of an inch, it's 1.5 inches, but it was the same process. I just ran it over my dado stack and made a little groove on either side. Made sure that the hinge was flush and had clearance, and then just cleaned it up a little bit. So to attach these piano hinges, I used the Vicks bit so that my holes stayed centered, and for the time being I only put about 3 screws in everything, just so I could play around with the fit without taking out 15 screws aside. And since you have those mortises, it's really easy. You can just line those hinges up with those mortises and attach both pieces. And just making sure that they're going to open and close, and everything was going pretty well at this point. So then I could attach the cabinet to the base coming towards the end here, and I used 2.5 inch screws to attach it from the edge, and then to really sure things up, I put 3/8 inch carriage bolts, 2 of them through the whole center. They're drilled at an angle as well, and once I put the nuts on the bottom, this really made everything super stable. Fun little tidbit I noticed the moment I finished putting this together is I put it on there upside down. So unfortunately, usually that's just a matter of undoing your work and flipping it the right way around, but I just drilled these huge holes in the bottom and I don't want to see those on the top. So I'm going to cut my losses, and I made this little drilling block based off the measurements up top so it will correspond with the alignment of the holes. They came down the same amount and in the same amount, so I could clamp this to my 4 pieces here, and then on this side, and drill new holes. So then I'm just going to put dowels in these anyway, so I'll have to put dowels in the old holes as well. So it's somewhat of an easy fix, but definitely annoying. So re-drilling those holes ended up not being that big of an issue, and this block I made was a little bit more accurate than the doweling jig anyway, so the fins ended up coming out a little bit nicer. When it came time to attach the doors, you can't really see it in the video, but I have about a 1/16 inch shim underneath the door, so when the door closes it doesn't drag on that base. And I still only put a couple hinges in all those a couple screws in those piano hinges while I was getting everything ready. So the last thing I had to do was, because of those picture buttons, I had to drill a little 5/8 inch, only like a 1/16 of an inch down hole that lined up with those picture buttons so the cabinet could close and not hit them. And then I also decided to put some rare earth magnets on the top and bottom of the doors, and as well as the centerpiece, just to kind of keep everything closed. So I just drilled also very shallow holes and then just epoxied those in place. So the storage in the wings is going to be mostly shelves. My hole saw kit fits in the bottom perfectly, and then I just added some shelves. I have little 3/4 inch blocks of wood that I screwed to the inside of the shelf, and then I put 1/2 inch pieces of plywood on top of those. I did it this way so that if I ever want to move things around inside the cabinet, it'd be really easy to do. I could just remove those little spacers and move things around. So I kind of built it up as I went. So I was adding things and then gauging the space I had left and adding more shelves. And the nice thing about this is I still have space on those 2 open wings to add pieces as I get them. So once this was done, it came time to clear coat it, and for the clear coat I ended up using General Finishes satin finish just because I bought a gallon of it and I'm trying to use it up because it's starting to skim over in the bucket. So this was a great way to use some of that finish up. I ended up putting 2 coats on the inside, and then I'll put 3 coats on the outside, but I haven't done the 3rd coat. And then the next morning I could roll into place and start filling it up. And because my floor is so slanted, I had to shim the bottom of it in order to get it flat. And then I'll have to shim the doors as well, just because I'm fighting against gravity constantly in the shop. I might think of a different way to keep those open if I want to use this with the drill press open. The final thing I did before I could start adding stuff was I put those dowels in there because I also stained those inner wings, and I didn't have 1/4-inch dowels, so if you don't have 1/4-inch dowels, what I ended up using was bits of pencils. Those actually are about 1/4-inch and fit in there pretty nicely, so I could just hammer those in the front and the back, and then the wings were attached as well. So in the bottom section, I just made a little open bay there because I have a bunch of auger bits that I don't really use, but I wanted to store them in here, so I just threw those in there. And then once again, my hole saw kit fits in there nicely. And then I just made these little trays for all of my drill bits, all my countersinking bits, all the different driver bits for Torx bits, slotted bits, Phillips bits, and all that stuff. And that goes on the 2 upper shelves. And on the other side, I have my 2 drill indexes and some leftover hole saw kits that I've gotten over the years. And that's pretty much the end for this build. It's kind of a weird little odd shaped piece of furniture, but I like it. I used up a lot of scrap, and it needed to be on wheels for me. I would have loved to have a cabinet down there, but I need to be able to move stuff around in my shop. It took a lot of stuff that I had laying around and put it in one easy, convenient space. I'll probably end up organizing it a little better over time, but for now, I think it's going to work well.